National History Center for the first seminar semester of the spring semester, and we are especially grateful to Shel Garen for coming all the way down from Princeton, especially to talk to us about, well, the title actually is a little, has undergone an evolution.
That's right.
It did begin as transnational mass consumption, borrowing, and savings in Japan and the United States, but I believe it acquired a more sexy thump to it. Shel originates in Minnesota. He got his BA at the University of Minnesota and went on to Harvard to get his MA and then to Yale to get his PhD. He now teaches at Princeton. I believe that this can be described as an ever upward sorrel. Shel, we very much look forward to your talk today.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be back. I was a fellow here last year. I had a wonderful time, and I went to this seminar many times, and so I'm glad to be part of it today. I should probably say something about the title. This is a new title, Beyond Our Means. It's not a title I came up with. I wish I had, but my press, Princeton University Press, which is going to be publishing this book at the end of this year, 2011, came up with it. And at first, I wanted to actually keep on Saving, which was my original title from that poster, but they convinced me that this was a better title. So that's what we have. And the talk today is based, it's in a sense, it's an outline of the book, but it really more than that focuses much more on what's happened in the United States in terms of saving and spending and borrowing in the last few decades. My own specialty, as Roger said, is Japanese history. But I found myself over the years gravitating much more to what we call either global history or transnational history. In other words, fitting Japan and other countries into global interchange, and I'll say more about that in a few minutes. So the book is quite broad, both in its time from 1800 to the present, but also in terms of its spatial orientation. It includes Japan, but also includes several European nations, the United States very centrally now, as in the title as you can see, and also other nations in Asia. So I'll be saying small things about some of the pieces, but quite a bit about the United States today. Well, let's start with the present. In the wake of the housing and financial meltdown of 2008, it became painfully obvious that millions of Americans lacked basic savings, the sort of savings they would need to protect themselves against things like foreclosures, unemployment, medical emergencies, not to mention the financial needs upon retirement. And in terms of policy, it's not that Washington is alive with a policy debate over this subject. I wish it were. But there are good people in Washington and other places who are trying to figure out how would you devise policies that might restabilize the finances of American households in terms of saving, spending, and borrowing. Most of the debate is very present-oriented, but I think we might actually learn something from what other countries have done in terms of encouraging saving and perhaps moderating borrowing. And we might also learn from certain episodes of the past, both in our own country and in other countries. So this is the sweep of the book. Now, it's well known that there are other countries in the world that save a lot. Normally, when we think of this, we tend to think of East Asia, starting with Japan, historically at least, in the 1970s. The Japanese economy, which was growing very fast in the post-war period, did it in part on the basis of its capital accumulation as a result of mobilizing domestic savings. By the mid-1970s, Japanese household savings rates, in other words, the savings rate of disposable income, had reached 23%, making it certainly one of the greatest savers of the time. Probably most of you don't know this, but what would be the other great saver? Anybody know at the time? Wouldn't be obvious? What? Well, not bad. Yes, Germany would be high, but actually Italy and Japan tended to jockey for the top position in the 1970s and 1980s. So we have this image of East Asians saving a lot. It wasn't just the Japanese, obviously, but historically in recent decades, the Japanese route of high savings was followed by South Koreans, Taiwanese, Singaporeans, and of course recently the Chinese, who nobody quite knows how to measure their savings rate, but it's estimated in at least a good comparative scale that it may be almost 26%. So the Chinese obviously save a lot. Now, the approach of journalists, economists, policymakers, when they think of other countries that save, well, we tend to think East Asian, and then when we think East Asian, we think culture, because somehow only East Asians have culture. The word culture is used. They have Confucianism, they have Asian values, they have some sort of Oriental shared values. And so if there's high savings somewhere in the world and it's only in East Asia, most journalists and economists assume that this must be some sort of cultural quirk, some sort of exclusiveness, and some sort of essential characteristic of the regional heritage. However, that's not actually true. It's not only East Asians who save a lot, but continental Europeans have saved a lot historically, and even more impressively, continue to save a lot. And I could have put a lot of other countries up on the screen there, but I chose some of the major ones. And you can see it's not the United Kingdom, which has tended to follow U.S. patterns, but France, Germany, Italy has come down, but France and Germany very high. Belgium I could have put up. The Netherlands, even Sweden, with its massive welfare state, now has quite high savings rates of about 10, 11%. Now, this is something that I find most American economists are either unaware of, that Europeans save, or they just don't want to think about it because it dislodges things. If it's not anomalous to save, then that means that maybe it's only anomalous that Americans don't save. And that maybe it's American behavior we have to explain, and East Asians and continental Europeans may have more in common. Now, as economists try and explain cross-national savings patterns, they come up with all sorts of reasons why people should save or not save. And what's interesting is most of them tend to be wrong. They look wonderful as theories, but they don't tend to apply when you look at Europe and other places in the world. For example, economists say that if you have elaborate welfare provision, either Social Security, national pension, national health insurance, unemployment, various safety nets, that this will be sort of a moral hazard. This will discourage people from saving. Well, last time I looked, places like France and Germany have pretty good welfare states. Sweden has a really good welfare state, and they're all high savers. So that one doesn't seem to work. Another thing the economists say is, well, it all boils down to demography. You have aging societies, and as societies age, it means you have fewer people at the productive phases of their lives. The older people are consuming. So as you have aging society, savings rates should drop. Well, that does work pretty well in Japan and in South Korea, but it certainly doesn't work in continental Europe, where everybody's got aging societies, Germany and certainly the others, and yet savings rates in some of the major European countries have not come down at all, despite aging. Well, going on and on, economists don't tend to do very well when they have to actually explain the world. They do very well when they have to explain their theories. And one factor that economists have not looked at and would never want to look at, I can assure you of that, is they would never want to look at history. What might history tell you about why people save or don't save? And what's interesting is about the East Asian and the European cases is that they may not have a common heritage. I mean, nobody would call the Europeans Confucian, but they do have a common history of the last 200 years where all of the places that have high savings are places that have had very active programs of promoting and encouraging saving and thrift. Doing it through ideas, but more concretely through various institutions that encourage people, ordinary people, people with small incomes to save. We call that small saving. So I'm not talking today in my lecture about large investors. I'm talking about trying to get entire populations to save. And all the countries that have high savings have been doing this for a long time. 100 years, 150 years, 200 years in many cases. Now, I tell this story, it's not simply a comparative history. It's a transnational history. Well, what's the difference? Well, comparative history would mean I'm just looking at these places in parallel and saying, well, the Germans save and the Japanese save, and what can we compare about them? I'm going much further. I'm talking about the transnational links among all these countries in the modern world. In the last century or two, there's been a tremendous interconnectedness in these stories. And I'm not just talking about savings now. You could talk about all sorts of ideas, institutions, that there have been global flows of knowledge about ideas and institutions starting in the 19th century, starting earlier. If anybody does early modern Europe, there's plenty of that going on then. But certainly the 19th century, the 20th century are very active periods in which nation states and reformers within nation states look around the world, particularly at countries they regard as their rivals or competitors, and say, what are they doing to build national power? What are they doing to build stable societies? And this story of encouraging saving fits within that. One other thing I should say about my own case, Japan or East Asia, the Japanese are often known as great imitators, so people who borrow from what's happening in the West. But this story of transnational exchange is not simply about one-directional borrowing. It's not simply about flows of information from west to east, as it were. But you see that there's really an active multi-directional sharing. And let me show you a slide that I'm sure nobody has ever seen. H.G. Wells wrote a little-noticed book in 1905 called A Modern Utopia, in which the heroes of his utopia are called the samurai. And that ratty-looking figure is actually meant to be his depiction of the samurai. They are the guardians of Wells's utopia. They are frugal, they are disciplined, they are honest, they are the best bureaucrats you could get. Well, why does he come up with the samurai? Well, because at that point in Britain, two things are happening, one could say globally. One is the British have been humiliated in the Boer War, and there's a national malaise, a feeling of decline. The other thing is that their ally in the Anglo-Japanese alliance, Japan, is in the process of winning a surprising victory against the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War. The Japanese are deemed to do this, deemed to be a model for Britain in terms of their mobilization of the home front, their total mobilization of not only savings, but of every man, woman, and child is the discourse. The British are very interested in this. So it's one example of how the arrows go back from Japan. Japan becomes a model for Britain, and then one can think, of course, of the 1980s. It seems a distant past now with the rise of China, but there really was an active learn from Japan craze in this country as well, in all sorts of institutions. So that's all I'm going to say specifically about transnationalism, but you're going to see that it really pervades my discussion. Now, what I'm going to do in the rest of the lecture is I'm going to give you a very quick historical run-through of how the institutions that promoted saving, widespread popular saving, arose in the modern world, and how they became diffused really throughout the advancing nations of the world. And I'm also going to put, in terms of these institutions that were created for saving, what's happening in Europe and East Asia, but then what is happening in a very different way in the United States, where the United States is part of the global discourse, but often goes its own way. And I know there's a lot of discussion of American exceptionalism and makes some people angry. I am not going to be talking about American exceptionalism today in a positive way. I'm talking about American exceptionalism in terms of why the United States does not follow the examples of the rest of the advancing nations of the world, and rather than promoting saving historically, more and more promotes consumption and more promotes borrowing or credit. Okay, let me talk about some of the institutions very quickly that evolve and that are spread around the world. One of them, the first one, goes back more than 200 years now to the late 18th century and early 19th century. These are institutions called savings banks. They arose all over Europe and very quickly spread. They arose first in German and Swiss cities, and then in Scotland, and then in England, France, and crossing the Atlantic Ocean, going to places like Australia. The savings banks originate as not as a financial institution, but as a social or moral institution. They originate usually as philanthropic institutions that tend to subsidize small saving, that make saving advantageous and attractive to the working poor, and in some cases to the lower middle class and to the middle class. A savings bank, unlike a commercial bank, would tend to accept fairly small deposits, would tend to pay fairly attractive interest, 2.5%, 3%, the sort of interest we die for today. Often this was done because philanthropists actually took money out of their pocket and subsidized the interest rates. And guaranteed, well, tried to guarantee some sort of solvency. Didn't always do so well. But so the savings banks was really the first institution. You can see it had a gendered component in this poster. By the middle of the 19th century, among middle-class families in Victorian Anglo-America, the idea that the housewife, this institution of the housewife, the woman who managed the household, might actually also be the caretaker of finances. So, as the slogan says, is my industry the husband's and her saving. And you're going to see that will come back to become very popular in East Asia in the 20th century in places like Japan and South Korea. Now, what's happening in the United States? Aren't there savings banks in the United States? Well, there are. But the thing about the United States in the 19th century is the unevenness really strikes you. America's a big country. There are other big countries, but America's a big country with very different regional zones. And parts of America, particularly the Northeast, sometimes the upper Midwest, tend to take a lot of the European innovations, and you find them much less in other places. In the case of savings banks, Northeast United States, particularly New England, savings banks on the European or English model are very popular. And have a real density. Most people, large numbers of the working class, will have savings accounts. As you move to the rest of the country, though, the savings banks on the European model thin out. There are some in the Midwest. There are some on the Pacific Coast. There are almost no savings banks in the rest of the country. And as a result, as you'll see, 1910, less than 16% of Americans had a savings account in any bank, commercial bank or savings bank, etc. And you can see the enormous regional variation. Over half of the population would have had savings accounts in New England, but then you come down to the 13 southern states, 3%. The great state of Texas, less than 1% in 1910. I'm sure it's much better now.
Okay. I noticed with interest.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, how does America stack up against other countries at the time? Again, 1910, not so long ago. If you just look at savings banks and postal savings banks, in many of the major countries, you'll see there's a high density of savings in savings banks or at the post office. Tends to be fairly concentrated in the 30 to 40 percentile in places like France or Germany or the UK or Sweden or the Netherlands or Japan, which you're going to hear about in a few minutes. If you, however, ask that same question based on pretty good statistics in the United States, if you only take savings banks in the beginning of the postal savings system at the time, only 10% of Americans, at least no more than 10%, would have had savings accounts in 1910. If you are generous to the Americans and you say, well, we'll throw in all the banks they might have accounts in, commercial banks, etc., you only get up to 16%, that statistic I had before. So America is a real outlier in terms of the number of people who actually formally save in a bank in 1910. This is pretty extraordinary. Now, we move on from savings banks to another institution that promoted savings, a big innovation in the middle of the 19th century, called postal savings banks or post office savings banks. This is where you save at the post office. It starts in 1861 in Great Britain. very quickly spreads. Belgium is really the next place. And then, of course, the British dominions. Interestingly enough, Japan, which has just set up a modern nation state in 1868, the Meiji Restoration, Japan is very quick into postal savings, established as just a few years after the Meiji Restoration in 1875. And as some of you know, that postal savings bank in Japan will go on in the late 20th century to become actually the world's largest bank. It'll become enormous, even become a political problem today in Japan. But its origins are very much in terms of this global or transnational diffusion. And post office savings banks spread throughout most of the rest of Europe during that period as well, and to many of the European colonies. Now, what does a post office savings bank do that's an advantage over even the savings banks? Well, because you have the gigantic postal systems, you have an economy of scale that allows these post office savings banks to process very small transactions without losing a lot of money. So you can take even smaller amounts of money, pennies, shillings, that sort of amount. So it caters itself very well to the working poor. The other thing that's really attractive about postal savings is now you have nation states guaranteeing the solvency of your saving. And that's very important because the savings banks, as attractive as they were, often went under. There was embezzlement, there was fraud, there was all sorts of things, insolvencies. Now people had the comfort of knowing that the money that they entrusted to strangers, in this case to the government, would be secured and nationally guaranteed. And of course, the other great advantage to the Postal Savings Bank is it's all over the place. Access is a big problem and remains a problem in this country today. Financial access, access of banking, particularly to the poor. Well, post offices went a long way towards solving that, particularly in large societies, because you could have rural post offices in places like Canada, the Yukon, Australia, taking people, New Zealand, sorry, excuse me, but that's not a large country. Okay. Anyway, taking your savings and having financial access. So the Post Office Savings Bank is another innovation. What about the United States? And, before we get to that, something for historians of architecture. Postal savings had become such a big deal by the turn of the 20th century that in Central Europe, governments actually competed against each other to line up the best architects and build the most modernist or fanciful buildings to house their postal savings. In other words, postal savings was seen as a great episode in social policy and something that you showcased. This is an amazing building, which you can still see in Vienna, the Austrian Postal Savings Building, designed by modernist architect Otto Wagner, and in nearby Hungary, the competing part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they did their own thing at exactly the same time, tended to use folklore, but also using various aspects of Art Nouveau. And you can see the beehive on the right, and there are ants climbing up it, and also ants? Bees, sorry, bees climbing up, and all sorts of things like that. Now, what about the United States? What does the United States do in this transnational discourse over postal savings? Well, you might be surprised to know there was actually interest here. That America also has its cosmopolitan reformers. They rarely get very far, but they had them. And in the 1870s, as soon as all the European countries and Japan were looking at the British system, so too did the U.S. Postmaster General's office. In 1873, postal bureaucrats drafted laws that they then had congressmen introduce, and they introduced them, and they introduced them, and they introduced them for nearly the next 40 years. Every year, dutifully. 1873, finally, in 1910, a bill actually got passed, which amazed everybody. And the United States, believe it or not, and most of you probably don't believe it, actually had a postal savings system. Does anybody remember it? Vaguely, yeah, okay. Because by our lifetimes, it was on life support. It didn't come out of World War II very well. It had done pretty well in the 1910s and 1920s, and especially 1930s with the Depression and the panics. But after World War II, it was dying more and more unpopular. And in 1966, to nobody's notice, it just died in its sleep. I mean, it was abolished by Congress, and that's why nobody can remember it. So once again, the United States is outside of what was pretty much, it's sort of like national health insurance. It's like something everybody else had, but we didn't have, and it's the public option, basically. It is the public option. It's the public option for saving. Well, we can talk about that later, but that's another U.S. exception. Now, another institution that promoted saving, and I hope some of you do remember this one, is school-based savings programs or thrift education. And at least we have that in America, but I'm going to talk, we have to nuance that one. Okay, this was designed in, probably pioneered in French cities, German cities, especially in Belgium by the 1860s. Particularly as postal savings banks developed, it was a very convenient way to get children to save. You would bring your savings in. I like the Belgian drawing on the left there. For those of you who read a little bit of French, children are coming out of the confiture, the candy store, having stuffed their face with candy and spent all their centime on that. And then there's this self-righteous pigtail sort of toward the right, and she's saying, no, 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 you know, don't spend your centime on candy, take it over to the Caisse d'Épargne, to the savings bank. And you can see there's a Japanese variation, I think a nice poster from the 1930s. This is a real transnational phenomenon. Educators found out that other nations were doing it, and you had just one of these mundane things in everyday life, but the sort of the transnational Monday, you could call it, where children came in each Monday and they brought their pennies or their centime or their Japanese sen in, and they lined up like this, and they did it from Melbourne here to Minneapolis. In the 1920s, I'm a native Minnesotan, as Roger pointed out. I like to think I could have been in one of those pictures. I remember doing things like that in the 50s. Like everybody, I was a good deal blonder in those days. But anyway, you had pockets in America that were doing what everybody else was doing on a more centralized basis. And yes, you had Minnesota, and if every place in America could be like Minnesota, that would be nice. But it wasn't. And even in Minnesota, there were pockets of resistance, like these children here, you know, to badly paraphrase Garrison Keillor, you know, there were, even in Minnesota, few below average. But in the rest of the country, there were a lot of people, a lot of school boards that were below average. And so the thing about school savings is some of you may have had it, because if you grew up in New York City or Los Angeles or some places that were very active, you had it. But if you grew up in most other states, the western states and the southern states, there's very little, because you depend on local school boards, you depend on savings banks, and other things. And if they're not there to help you warehouse the savings and things like that, it's not going to happen. So again, because America doesn't have a very active postal savings program, because it doesn't have many savings banks and small savers institutions, school savings suffers as well. Well, we move on to war savings. And this becomes a big phenomenon in the two world wars, and of course becomes very global. One of the things about war is it tends to spread transnational phenomena faster than almost anything else, because you want to keep up with your enemy. If your enemy is mobilizing, in this case, mobilizing finances to pay for the war, getting people to save, buy savings bonds and things like that, you want to make sure your financial mobilization is just as good. Propaganda. We tend to think of propaganda, well, it's nationalistic. Well, sure, it's nationalistic, but it's very international and transnational. In other words, propagandists look at what other propagandists are doing, and that's why I brought this poster here. What could be more American than Uncle Sam saying, "I want you," for the U.S. Army? Well, it was a ripoff. They stole it from the British, because they have Lord Kitchener there, and then the Canadians in this French-Canadian poster ripped it off from both, maybe the Americans and the British, probably the British. But you have all sorts of things where the whole message on how you mobilize people and how you use moral suasion is remarkably transnational. Look at this one. Use of gender in war mobilization. Seeing women really for the first time as the guardians of the home front, the people who have to be mobilized, have to have their money mobilized, their work mobilized in order to win the war. Well, here you have two Joan of Arc's posters. One, they're identical except for women of Britain, women of America. This is not a coincidence. They're from the same year. The propagandists were working together. In this case, actually, the American Joan of Arc came first for one simple reason. Joan of Arc is not a real icon of English nationalism, if you remember your 100 Years' War. So this is a ripoff from the Americans and a rather stupid one because nobody likes Joan of Arc in England, but very popular in America. The only place I couldn't find Joan of Arc, of course, is France, but they have Marianne. Okay. But the iconography then goes over to Japan. You see this juxtaposition in all sorts of posters, including the Japanese poster from the 1920s, very similar to the American poster on the left, the sort of the woman in the forefront as the mother, the saver, and then, well, in this case, either the men at war or the men working, but this sort of gender division of labor when it comes to savings. We move on to World War II. It's really a continuation. Savings campaigns are very important in terms of financial mobilization, economizing, in other words, not wasting, not using materials that could be used by the war front, and then by economizing, of course, you're saving as well. The squander bug on the right there was deemed to be Britain's most popular poster during World War II, a.k.a. Hitler's pal, and a shopper's disease and that sort of thing. The iconic bare-chested worker you're going to see is everywhere, including Japan. Okay, same guy. He could have found it in Russia. He could have found it in Italy. Axis allied doesn't really matter. They all use bare-chested men, workers, because workers are earning a lot of money, and you want to capture their saving. Well, the mobilization of women in World War II to be the people who knock on doors at the local level and get people to buy savings bonds or British savings certificates, or in this case, in the Japanese case, buy China bonds. There's the iconic woman who's the head of some sort of patriotic or mobilization association at the kind of the ward level or the village level, and she goes around knocking on doors in Britain, in the immediate post-war in Japan, during the China War and World War II. Also trying to get people to save for post-war consumption. You can't spend now, but if you save and save and save, like this British woman, that you might be able to afford luxuries like the hand-powered lawnmower there up in the upper left. I mean, that's the British idea of hyperconsumption. You're going to see the American one in a minute. Well, America, does it participate in this transnational war savings? Well, very definitely. This is the one moment in American history where small savings are actively promoted for the war, but also to get ordinary people to save. It comes out of New Dealism as well as it comes out of total war. It's a social policy. Bonds as well as taxes and trying to keep down inflation. America adopts what the other countries are doing at the time, whether it's Japan or Britain or Germany, getting people to save at the workplace. One of the most effective ways, something that maybe we could do a little more of today, and not simply for retirement accounts. But the payroll savings plan enrolls 27 million Americans at its height in 1944. This is when America's looking a lot more like the rest. What happens in 1945 when the war ends? Well, you see a pattern developing where America's quite exceptional. We'll talk about that in a minute. But where the rest basically keep on saving. In other words, the war ends in places like Britain in 1945, but a big series of British propaganda right at the end of the war was the Keep On Saving campaigns. Lots of Keep On Saving posters. The message being that, yes, the war is ending, the Germans have been defeated, the Japanese are about to be defeated, but that doesn't mean that Britons can stop saving or that they can start spending. The version in Britain or Japan or the Germanys or in Italy or wherever in post-war Europe and East Asia is that the austerity and savings campaigns have to continue for reconstruction, but also to fund new expenses here, if you can see on the right, like education, housing, health, in other words, the emergence of the British welfare state. And you see the same reconstruction sort of posters in France and Italy. In Japan, the post-war movement is called national salvation. You've got to save so that Japan can rebuild and become a first-rate nation again, national salvation. Well, after the post-war era is over, very quickly in Europe, savings campaigns on the wartime scale, of course, don't continue, but you've got the institutions of small saving continue. The German savings banks, called Sparkassen, persist. They're still at the center of most German towns. In France, the Livret A, the small savers account that's basically subsidized by the government, offers above-market interest rates, starts in 1818. It's going strong today. French postal savings is going strong today. In Germany, lots of emphasis on school savings programs as well. In Japan, in the post-war period, the post-war doesn't seem to end, at least not until about the 1990s. Very intrusive savings campaigns, very highly centralized, continue until the 1990s, very focused on women, the housewife as the saver. And Japanese campaigns, again, have a transnational element in their region, in East and Southeast Asia, as the Japanese economic miracle becomes very well known. The Japanese model, in all of its aspects, becomes emulated in other parts of East and Southeast Asia, particularly the rapidly growing economies. Korea, of course, because of the Japanese colonial period, probably the most influenced, run very similar Japanese-style campaigns, again, until the late 1990s. In Singapore, same children lining up, and, of course, if you were the Singaporean former Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, you would say this is an outstanding example of Asian values. Unlike those degenerate Westerners, Asian children know how to line up, they know how to save, they know how to work hard. Whoops, looks like they do in other places as well. And so is it Asian values? Is it the fact that Singapore might have been a British colony? Is it the fact that the Japanese occupied Singapore during World War II and provided a stunning model in the post-war period? There's a whole mix. This is not simply Asian essentialism, but this is a lot of transnational flows in action. Well, America. Let's end with America. I suspect you're going to have a lot of questions about this because it's happening right now. But what's so interesting is that in 1945, America, which had looked a lot like the others during World War II and under total war, begins diverging significantly and then very rapidly from what the Europeans and the East Asians are doing. The savings campaigns end. In 1945, America doesn't have to keep on saving. It certainly doesn't have to keep on saving the way the Europeans or the Japanese are doing. There are some obvious reasons for this. America was extraordinarily wealthy coming out of World War II. None of the other countries were. The Americans, and this is a old hat to those of you in American history, but certainly coming out of the Depression, coming out of World War II, and into the post-war period, there's a politics of consumption. Both of the political parties, labor, management, all sorts of forces, and certainly including the Keynesians, embrace consumption and widespread spending as the engine of economic growth and even democratization. So whereas in everywhere else, it's savings and austerity is the key to social democracy, to justice, to getting the economy going, in America, consumption becomes valorized as the engine of growth. And of course, we're still living with that today. Just think about how obsessed we are with Christmas sales. There's no other country that is quite so nervous about how much people will spend at Christmas as our own. You might remember that British poster where the woman was saving for post-war consumption. It was a hand-powered lawnmower. This is what Americans dream of. In 1943, this is a school savings newsletter. It's hard to read, but it's about the world 10 years hence, the world of 1953 when your 10-year bond comes due. What can you buy with it? Not a lawnmower. Certainly not a hand-powered one. You can have a private air car. That's in the middle. You can take weekend to Newfoundland. You can take trips to Madagascar. You can have in the upper left panel, you can have all sorts of new electronic devices, voicemail, all sorts of things new types of clothes. Americans are dreaming big of consumption. They didn't actually have to dream that much. Okay, they didn't get their private air cars, but they got most of the other stuff. And so this is on a scale that it was a promise. In a sense, a lot of the promise was fulfilled. And it's another reason why consumption becomes so important. U.S. savings rates, what happens? Well, it's not that Americans in the post-war period stopped saving altogether. In fact, in the early post-war decades, they actually save at a reasonable rate. Far less than Europeans, far less than Japanese, but at a pretty good rate. 7%, 8%, 9%, even 11% in the early 1980s. And then savings falls off the cliff. In the mid to late 1980s, going all the way until about the last 2 years, as you've noticed, savings just plummets to near zero. Americans, on a large scale, simply stopped saving. How do we explain that? Well, I think it probably makes sense to break this into long-term factors in the post-war period and short-term. The long-term are fairly obvious. I'm not going to say a lot about them. But one of the things is home ownership and the home mortgage. Americans become accustomed. I mean, it starts in the New Deal period, but certainly accelerates in the post-war. Americans become accustomed to what you could call saving through home ownership. Home mortgages are made extremely attractive in the 1930s as a result of federal intervention. Then later, post-war tax deductions. You can have a long-term mortgage, much cheaper than you can get in most other countries for various reasons. So the idea that you build up your nest egg through home ownership certainly is one of the things that's going on. It's pretty reasonable. It's pretty sustainable until about the 1990s, and then it goes haywire. That's another story. Suburbanization, American housing becomes more and more spread out. Houses become bigger. I could give you the statistics later on the average house size in America versus basically the rest of the world. The rest of the world, not just the Japanese, live in rabbit hutches. We live in huge homes. I mean, you can show this statistically, and they're spread out. They're in suburbs. You've got to have cars. You have lawns. The whole scale of your heating, your cooling, your transportation, everything, it really stimulates consumption. And of course, then the spread of consumer credit. Americans are the pioneers in installment buying in the 1920s, comes back in the 1950s, and then other forms of consumer credit. Home ownership, we won't say too much about that, but it was always high in post-war America. But of course, in the mid-1990s, it starts spiking up. I'm not going to say too much about this, but home ownership, the United States is not the only country with high home ownership, but the United Kingdom actually has followed in our footsteps, and of course the big places like Canada, fairly high. Australia, very high. But again, Japan, continental Europe, home ownership tends to be at lower levels. Germany is, in Austria, the outstanding case is very low home ownership. Low 40s, very low, much more renting. But of course, that too figures into the countries that have higher savings tend to have lower rates of home ownership. Okay, let's talk about finally the, sorry. Okay, recent developments. Okay, this is a history of really since 1980. All sorts of things really break loose in 1980, and then they gallop in terms of expanding borrowing and diminishing saving. Most of these I think you know about, but certainly credit cards become liberalized, deregulated around 1980, and then of course we have this whole predatory practices that grow up around it. Home equity loans hasn't gotten much attention in this country, but that's another aspect of the 1980s that starts with the 1980 tax reform when home equity loans become the only form of credit that's tax deductible, other than mortgages themselves. That really brings about an avalanche in terms of people going seriously into debt. The home equity loan was called, by worried people at the time, the homeowner's gigantic credit card, because it actually gives you much more access to credit than a credit card does. It gives it a much more reasonable rates, 5-6%, and you get this huge line of credit, and it can be for tens of thousands of dollars. And suffice it to say, large numbers of American homeowners went crazy and just figure there's no reason to save anymore, you could just simply borrow anything you needed. What's the point in saving? Subprime mortgages we know about, growing income equality, especially after 2000, stagnation of real wages, even decline for working people, for the lower quintiles, all this happening as people at the bottom and the middle are sustaining more and more debt. So it's an explosive combination. And then finally, from the 1980s on, Americans stopped thinking of themselves as savers and started thinking of themselves as investors. They started chasing returns. Money markets came in, stocks came in. The whole point that developed mentality was that you were sort of a sucker if you just kept your money in the bank at 3 or 4%. You should be an investor. You should be getting 10%. And we've seen what happens with that. You chase returns, people get into a lot of trouble, sustain a lot of risk. Well, let me close by just giving you, this is a Woodrow Wilson Center moment. You know, in the rest of the world, as all this is happening, you shouldn't think that in Europe and Japan that they have been globalized by the American model. You shouldn't think that everybody else in the world is binging on credit cards. Journalists write about it that way. It's just not true. And in Germany, in France, in Belgium, there are very few things that would resemble a credit card. People have things that look like credit cards, but they're really debit cards that you pay back, and you pay them out of your savings or your checking account. In Japan, people have credit cards, but almost nobody borrows against their credit card. They pay it back in full. And so I'll close with my Wilson Center moment. A fellow Italian scholar from last year, Marilena Galla. I don't know if you remember her. But she was always fun to talk about cross-national comparisons with. And she was very perplexed when she had to leave the country and close her American bank account down. And she had her bank ATM card, which had Visa written on it. So she assumed it was a credit card, and she didn't know how she was going to close it because wouldn't you have to wait around 30 days? And I said, no, it's a debit card. And I said, you know, we don't get our credit cards normally from banks. You know, we tend to apply online to respond to all those mailed solicitations. And so this really confused her. And she said, well, but then how do you pay your credit card bill each month? And I said, well, you know, that's easy. We just send a check or a transfer to some address in South Dakota or Georgia. And she said, well, that makes no sense. And true, it wouldn't make any sense to an Italian or a German or a Belgian who rarely encounters an American-style credit card. And so then Marilena continued, well, what would happen if you didn't have enough money in your bank account to pay the credit card bill at the end of the month? And I brightened up and I said, oh, gosh, that's no problem at all. Because, half the country doesn't pay their credit card bill at the end of the month. They pay, the 2% minimum. And I said, and besides, the companies want you to go into debt so they can make all sorts of money on high interest charges. And so that really got her. And she shrugged again and said, that really makes no sense. And so I was loath to tell my Italian friend that to most Americans, neither she nor her country make any sense at all. Because according to our economists, Italy is plagued by, quote unquote, financial repression because customers can't borrow so easily in Italy. Well, so who's right? When societies with such fundamentally different assumptions cohabit the capitalist world, surely we require a more historical understanding about how these rival cultures of saving and debt came to be. And my book is dedicated to making sense of it all. Thank you.
Charles, to open the discussion, could I take you back to the very beginning when you were talking about the Anglo-Japanese alliance? And a couple of years later, in 1905, H.G. Wells producing his book Utopia and so on. Can you tell us a little bit about the Japanese side of this? What points were the Japanese picking up at the same time? The reason I'm asking the question, I'm trying to get my chronological bearings, and it seemed to me that the turn of the century was rather a critical time in the beginning of the development of your story.
It is. I mean, it's not the only critical time, but it's a very tense time. I mean, it's a tense time in terms of international relations, and certainly a harbinger of many rivalries that will erupt in World War I. And in a sense, the Russo-Japanese War is very important because it is the biggest war since the American Civil War, and certainly on an international scale, probably the biggest war since the Napoleonic Wars. So there are a lot of foreign observers who go to the Russo-Japanese war front, generally on the Japanese side. The Japanese are very clever in terms of PR, and they invite British journalists and American journalists and various European journalists. And particularly the British come back enamored of Japan's mobilization in all sorts of ways. They like their military hygiene, their military strategy in general, but they really like this home front mobilization. But your question is about what the Japanese saw. Well, let me put it in terms of sort of a leapfrog. So the Japanese in the late 19th century are emulating all sorts of things from Britain and other places. I mean, like the Postal Savings Bank and school savings programs from continental Europe. Then the British in 1904 and 5 find that the Japanese have things they can teach the British. And in World War I, a lot of British mobilization, there's a big, something called national savings movement that starts in Britain. The people who start this highly centralized British World War I era savings campaigns were actually Japanophiles, I found. And there's a funny story that the director, who was an investment banker who loved Japan, and the end of the war, World War I, he's presented with a Japanese samurai sword. And then he said, it is that spirit of Bushido, in other words, the cult of the samurai. That is what won the war for we British. Because like Japan, we succeeded in mobilizing every man, woman, and child. So things are spinning back and forth. And then in the 1920s, the Japanese are looking for a new model of savings campaigns, and they like the British World War I version. So they emulate that very consciously. So the stuff goes back and forth, and it tends to build. It's this sort of, this best practice effect, you could call it. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, very interesting.
Okay. You want to call
Yes.
people?
If I can just hop on to the end of that, the other thing that you need to remember about...
Could you identify yourself?
Oh, sorry. Carol Sang, I'm a retired historian of Japan. I just wanted to point out that in 1905, the U.S.-Japan alliance, the other thing that it gave Japan is still struggling to get out from under unequal treaties.
The Anglo-Japanese line.
Anglo-Japanese alliance, yeah. Japan is still struggling to get out from under unequal treaties. And so they're trying very much to enhance their prestige in the West. And the Anglo-Japanese alliance gave them a good deal of prestige, as did their victory in the war against Russia.
Yeah.
And so that's
Right.
the other component that I think is very important to remember if you're asking about what the Japanese got out of the alliance.
Susan Carruthers. Back here. Yeah, there we go.
I'm Susan Carruthers, a historian at Rutgers in Newark and a fellow here this year. Coming from the samurai side of Europe, I was struck that your Europe ends somewhere not very far east. And you said in your very final sentence something that made that a little more explicit, that you're talking about circulation within the capitalist world. But I'm wondering whether there was indeed circulation between the capitalist and non-capitalist worlds after World War I and after 1945, and what that looked like and what forms it took.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, interestingly enough, and I don't know too much about before World War II, but certainly after 1945, Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union similarly had savings and austerity campaigns that didn't look so different. They're different in terms of how the banking structure is organized, and of course which you can keep. But the idea of this sort of mass mobilization of savings, and there are various types of savings banks and savings institutions. And I don't know too much about the Soviet Union, but I know in Poland and places like that, and in East Germany. East Germany continued to use the savings bank system, that they inherited from the pre-war, the Sparkassen. I remember, when there still was in Eastern Europe, because I've been at this for a long time, I think, but maybe not. But in the 1990s, when you would have a Hungarian or somebody and you'd give this lecture in front of them, and they'd say, wow, that sounds just like when I grew up, not so long ago in communist Hungary or in communist Poland. So I think this idea of sort of moral suasion movements, anti-consumption movements, economizing, austerity, and all dressed up in terms of of fairness and contributing to the greater good of society, I mean, I think you would find that resonated, on both sides of the divide. Of course, the place that resonated the least was the United States. But as I said, Western Europe and East Asia would probably look not so different in terms, at least, of the verbiage. I think the substance is different.
Charlie Mayer.
Hi, I'm Charles Mayer. I'm a fellow here this semester. I guess I'm wondering whether the correlations are one, either too narrow or maybe too wide. I do remember, even as a little kid, buying war stamps, at the end of the war and when nursery school and kindergarten. I finally, by the way, traded them in 1963 because inflation was going. And I remember, or in the 70s, and I remember going to the bank and seeing an older colleague and saying, sir, I've just traded in my war bonds. And he said, well, Charles, no one will say you didn't do your part. But the question is the following. There are so many correlations. First of all, Japan, Germany, and Italy. Yes, they're fascist states. You're not claiming this has any effect. But the notion of a strong state, you are saying, is important. And of course, all states are relatively attempting to be strong states in wartime. And a lot of the savings, transnational savings effect, is the effort not to raise the money that they raise is not very great by these means, but the inhibition of consumption is considerable. I would strong states. What about family uncertainties? If you ask about the Italians, few people would say they really have a strong state, but though at times they do. But there's clearly an ethos or a sense of somehow, perhaps, of family uncertainty unless you do save. That you have to. There's always something that's going to knock you for a loop unless you've piled it away someplace. And I just think, the story seems to me. I think what I found most convincing is the post-war American story of prosperity. That these constraints on scarcity, just in a sense, seem to disappear. And I wonder whether the existence of the institutions, we can, people could have continued to go to savings banks. We have them. And I just wonder whether you have any other indices about family which you might plug into this story, as well as wartime posters and the like, and longer-term issues of how families see their continuity. We know birth rates have to do with demography and whether you expect the survival of children or don't, and maybe there's something about piling up money which has to do about what you do, how your children will fare. I have no answers, but this was not a variable I saw at stake.
Yeah. Well, probably for good reason. I'm not sure what to do with the family part. I can certainly talk about uncertainty and these other things. What's so interesting is maybe strong state is very important. Maybe that's one of the big things. But you've got a lot of different societies basically behaving in similar ways. I take exception when you say I'm just talking about fascists. Unless you want to call the French and the Belgians and the Dutch and the Swedes and even the British for their time fascists. We're talking about a lot of different places where America looks more anomalous, and I don't think the politics is the big thing. Now, uncertainty, I think uncertainty is an interesting thing. It's not an absolute thing. It's something that's subjective. People feel uncertain or they don't feel uncertain. It's clear that until, the last 2 or 3 years, that Americans are a very optimistic people. They do expect things to get better. And we know that, just in the various peoples we study, that nobody's quite as optimistic as Americans. On the other hand, objectively, Western Europe, Japan, these are pretty prosperous places. Should they be so much more pessimistic that you have this enormous divide between how Americans save and consume and how they do? Is there any reason why Germans, at least in material terms, could have decided that maybe they're going to consume a lot more. Maybe they're going to buy a lot more houses. I mean, this is not impossible. I was just in Munich, and I was in the Munich train station, and I noticed that it was in the middle of winter. It was in December. It was 20 degrees out, and that all their stores were outside, and nobody was complaining, and they were existing in this. Americans would not stand for that. We'd have to heat. Well, they seem pretty hardy, and I didn't see them heating huge spaces, and I think you'd have to agree with that. I mean, that in terms of consumption, there's no reason materially why they have to behave in a way that Americans think is pretty austere, but they do. Maybe housing size, maybe that's your best correlation, because, generally where you have small... Well, I have looked at housing size. I mean, we've got, and that one correlates pretty well. If you got big houses, you're going to consume more because you got to put a lot of stuff in them, and you got to heat them, and all that sort of thing. And the average German new dwelling is about 1,200 square feet, and the average Japanese is about 1,000. The average Italian is about 900 square feet, and the average American is 2,300 square feet. So, I mean, you do have, that might be, I mean, if you want to get quantitative, that might be the best. But I am proposing actually a different way of looking at things. I think I want to use culture, but I don't want to use culture in this sort of national character sort of way. I don't want to use it in a mutable way. But certain cultures get formed and reformed, and most of the rest of the first world has cultures that clearly value environment, austerity more, a sort of a positive virtue on frugality. Americans much, much less. Those words resonate less. The word saving resonates much less now than it did in your day. And so how American culture got formed and reformed is a major part of the story. Again, I'm not trying to use national character stereotypes, but I'm trying to look at how institutions, ideas, politics interact to create certain norms of what people think is the good society. And in America, as you said, the inhibitions, the restraints have gradually, and then rapidly, I'd say in the last 15 to 20 years, been removed. But we could go on and on. Probably people want to talk about that.
Right.
I'm Gavin Wright from Stanford and a fellow at the center this year. I learned one very important thing from your talk, and that's because I started school in New York City in the 50s and moved from there to Minneapolis. And I would have said that the whole country was into school savings programs in those days. Now I know it was only
you were above average
places I happened to be. But my question is a bit different. You say economists haven't looked at this subject, but there is a subset known as economic historians, although not represented at Princeton University.
No.
And I was waiting to hear your take on the large literature on the increase in the U.S. savings rate in the 19th century, which doubled or tripled from the 1830s to the turn of the 20th century, despite the institutional deficiencies that you highlight.
Right.
And I'm just there, a set of competing hypotheses about that, although I don't think most of them are international, which is...
No.
But my question is, does your book or your narrative account for that phase in which the U.S. was a high-saving country?
Okay. Question is, what is a savings rate? Okay, you can, and a savings rate is a highly aggregate thing. I mean, we have to be careful with savings rates. I mean, I didn't give you, an advisory on that, but I should have. But so 19th century economic historians, 19th century U.S. Tend to measure this in the aggregate, and the fact is that America has huge pockets of wealth, and I mean it has, not just isolated, but I mean it has a significant percentage of people with wealth, with landed wealth and things like that. They're going to show up, those people, as high savers, and they're going to skew it. What we call the Bill Gates effect. What I did was something that I thought was pretty original. I actually asked, how many people actually have a savings account? Because I don't actually care if there are large savers. That's not my story. That's fine if you're talking about capital accumulation. But I'm not an economic historian. I don't care about capital accumulation. I care about household financial stability, whether people on a widespread basis have access to saving, and I have not seen, well, nobody's refuted me. Nobody's seen what I've done, obviously. But they're going to say, they're going to say exactly what you said. But what difference does it make if huge proportion of the population doesn't have savings accounts? Now, there are other ways of saving. You can hoard, you can do things like that. But people do that everywhere else, and they have savings accounts. I mean, I don't think it's a substitute. So that would be my answer. Roger, you calling people? Okay. Yeah. You had your hand up. Yeah.
Oh, thanks. Chris Barrett, I'm the Australian scholar here at the Centre.
The Australian scholar.
There's only one of us.
Okay.
So I was interested in one of the cross-country comparisons, which is you had Melbourne, which is my hometown, up there. Australia is a similarly consumerist society to America. Our savings rates are nearly as low, but not quite as low. What I'm interested in is whether you see the financial deregulation and the political momentum towards deregulation that you talked about from the 80s onwards, which seems to me to also be a very big part of this story, whether you see that as independent from the consumerism or following from it. Because, for example, Australian society, highly consumerist, but did not get caught up as much in the financial deregulation that, for example, has precipitated the most recent crisis. And I'm wondering whether there's some independent value in this country towards sort of, financial innovation, technological change, those kinds of things that, whether it's not just consumerism, but whether there's a separate sort of impulse for innovation, which then creates all these, effectively financial weapons of mass destruction.
Well, it's a very good question. I know some things about Australia. I don't know as much as I should, but certainly there is a sort of for want of a better word, an Anglo-Saxon pattern. Okay, the English-speaking countries, which, with the exception of the UK, tend to be fairly large, extensive, large houses, things like that. There's that. I mean, when you say Australia is a consumerist society, historically that's not necessarily true. I remember going to Australia for the first time in 1991 when there's still sort of the vestiges of protectionism, and you had these big, inefficient vacuum cleaners that cost a lot. I mean, it was a pretty protected society, throughout much of the 20th century, and that's, is much more pro-production than it was pro-consumer. So the consumerist thing is something fairly recent, as you say, probably from the 80s on. I think financial deregulation is a big thing. Financial deregulation didn't necessarily stem from consumerism. And in some ways, in America, I mean, a lot of the deregulation was actually meant to help savers, to give them higher interest rates. And it wasn't meant for people to stop saving. So I think they are somewhat independent, but their effect, as you said, has tended to be to advance huge amounts of credit. So in Australia, okay, you didn't have quite as much financial deregulation, but you've got a lot of American-style credit cards, revolving credit, people borrowing. You've got a lot of home equity loans, I believe. And you've got a lot of the same idea, at least in the last 20 years, of people saving or investing through housing. So you wouldn't find that as much in Germany, you wouldn't find it as much in France, you wouldn't find it in Belgium. So that's where I think the Anglo-Saxon pattern comes out.
Sorry to just jump in at the end, but
yeah.
We had our political system actually did insist on some limits on that deregulation.
Right.
And we could see it, taking off and actually imposed some limits. So we never got into subprime, we never got into a bunch of these areas, and I'm just interested whether that drive for innovation, that drive to always, have the latest and the best products in that area, and be a world-leading financial, because that's what the US always used to say about the rest of the world, a world-leading financial sector. Whether that, in a sense, got away from itself, and the political system was unable to arrest it as it was in other countries.
Yeah, that's actually a big part of my story. I mean, it's true I used a lot of posters today because that's visually the way you present this. But no, I spent pages and pages on financial deregulation and why, as you say, it got away from. Yeah, I mean, it did. I mean, the political restraints, I mean, I think to a radical degree were eliminated here. And what you say about Australia is interesting because, there are still vestiges of social democracy. I know most Australians say, well, there aren't any left. But, as an American, when I went, I mean, you see them because you have some comparison. And there is some sense that maybe predatory lending is not a nice thing, whereas we just say, well, the market rules. And so it's the radicalism of American deregulation, I think, that led to where we are.
Jim Grossman,
I'm curious about the housing
could
policy.
you introduce yourself?
Jim Grossman from the AHA. I don't know much about the housing policies in the other countries that you have here. And are we way at the edge in terms of encouraging home ownership? Because it seems to me that in that case, it all depends on your definition of savings, which you actually mentioned, that it's not only the single-family home, but you have working-class people, ironically European immigrants in the early 20th century, whose form of saving is, in fact, the second home. It's the home at the back of the lot in many cities. That is how they save. So they wouldn't show up in your data as having savings accounts. But those are people who are indulging in great thrift by, in essence, securing their old age or their parents' old age through the house at the back of the lot.
Yeah.
So, and the mother-in-law units in the basement. I mean, so I do wonder how much of American home ownership is, in fact, a form of saving. The other thing is your data on the South are easily explainable, which is that it's probably the only place in all the places you're looking at where people are actively discouraged from saving and not permitted to save. So that's public policy, not culture. It's very obviously public policy.
Sure. Well, public policy and culture are very
Yes, those are closely
I'm
right.
not using cultural
Right,
as some
right.
sort of,
But there is
it's not
specific
an
policy there.
analysis.
But I do wonder, so that how much of this really is just differences in home ownership
Sure.
policies.
Well, okay. Your question has several parts, but one is the people, the immigrants who were saving through housing also did have savings accounts. In fact, immigrants are great savers. And in the early post-war period, you could say that's when America was most imbalanced. I mean, saving through housing is not a stupid thing to do. What the stupid thing was that it got unbalanced, it got unhinged, where all the incentives here went into putting every dollar you had into housing. Whether it was through home equity loans, whether it was buying a bigger house than you, whether trying to get into the housing market before the prices went even higher, which is the 1990s, early 2000s story. So it's how things got away again, going back to your term, where the incentives got so skewed toward supposed saving through housing that at a certain point, you are putting all your eggs in one basket. Now you ask, what do other countries do? And that's interesting. I don't know as much as I should, but there is very little, as I understand, even in the other English-speaking countries, that approaches American public policy and its support for housing. I don't know if that sounds right to you. There isn't the sort of there isn't the Freddie Mac. Well, there isn't the mortgage deduction, but there also isn't the the Federal Housing Authority, which gives us, things like Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae and all that sort of thing. It starts in the 30s. This backup, this basically insurance of the banks, to offer the mortgages. There's very little equivalent that in the other countries that have fairly high ownership. There's certainly no equivalent to it in places like Germany and Austria that have very low home ownership. And in fact, the other thing is that a lot of continental Europe has things called social housing, which we have the pejorative term public housing, but has a much nicer valence, at least in early post-war Europe. And often, middle class, lower middle class, as well as working class people lived in rental properties that in one way or another had certain public policy advantages. So it's that our public policy does nothing for people who rent. It discourages, disincentivizes, pushes them into risky housing purchases often. That's what I would say. There's nothing wrong with saving through housing. It's how unbalanced it got.
Yes.
Jim Sang, retired. You've talked about Korea and Japan, but you've avoided the 200-pound turkey. What would you say about what's going on in the People's Republic? As late as 1930, I know in Shanghai, most banks did not take small accounts. So small savings is quite novel in China.
Well, it was. Now, of course, it's huge.
How did they do that without?
Well, okay. So, you're right. This is where we come strong state, weak state paradigm again. Of course, I mean, Republican China was not a particularly strong state. I mean, I think strong states are a very big part of this story. I mean, back to Charlie's point. But I mean, you had this fledgling Chinese postal savings system that was established in either the late teens or 1920s, and it did okay, but the republic was pretty much falling apart and couldn't assert itself. And then Mao eliminated the postal savings system, and of course, with such a hyper form of communism, there was very little in the way of money in Maoist China. People hoarded and things like that, but they didn't really have a place to put it. And then, in the late 1970s, as you well know, under Deng Xiaoping, the reforms were announced, and I don't think any Chinese wants to hear this, but this is when China turns Japanese. They send delegations over to. No, they don't want to. No, you can't tell it to Koreans either, I found. But Chinese delegations went over to Tokyo. They studied the post office system. Of course, they set up the four great banks that we know today, and many of them were also, especially the agricultural one, very much oriented towards small savings, and with unbelievably large numbers of branches. Postal savings came in the 1980s. It accounts for about 10% of savings in China today, and that includes like the big people. So it's very big in mobilizing small savers. I mean, millions and millions. I mean, the amounts are staggering. The number of branches are staggering. The number of bank employees who aggressively look for small savings in China is staggering. So you could say that China became part of this transnational process in the 1980s or after 1979. Oh, yeah. I mean, it's all about the state. I mean, it's hard to do these things without a state, I think. I mean, this is why I don't like all the microfinance, microsavings stuff. Yeah, sure, you feel good and you subsidize, match somebody, Mexican villages, savings. It's not an equivalent to setting up a full-fledged nationwide system.
Hi, Stephen Lipson, a student at Catholic University.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious to know, how do you explain what's happened in Britain? Because
Yeah.
the U.S. is, by and large, 200 years of not saving, and
Right.
Western Europe and Japan are, by and large, 200 years of saving.
Mm-hmm.
And the U.K. was definitely the mainstream of saving and actually one of the innovators of saving, and now you mentioned your stats
Yeah.
that they're very near the bottom.
Yeah. I mean, Britain is it's the one I lay awake up thinking about, because it's not clean like all the other cases, America or the others. Okay, as you say, I mean, you stated it perfectly. What happens in Britain? Well, I would say the financial deregulation is a big thing, and you help me out on this, but the Big Bang in the 1980s in Britain is big. Right. And so you get, the end of financial repression, such as it is. I mean, the very free flow of finance, the globalization of finance, lots of money washing around, money that you're, almost giving away at, very favorable terms to people. So Britain's got, from the mid-1980s on, has got all the stuff I think that the U.S. has, and it's not identical, but it's got the home equity loans, it's got the credit card binging. What is interesting about the British case, Tony Judd actually mentioned this to me once, before he died, that the British case, why it's different from the American is, in a sense, you have even more consumer credit because the British system has a safety net if you fail. So it really, I don't think this is a total explanation because it doesn't, you have safety nets in these other places and it doesn't happen. But the combination of the financial deregulation, all this ample supply of credit, and the sense that, you can borrow, but, you still got national health care. You've got various unemployment things. You've got various public assistance. And so, in a sense, you could say that the disincentives for restraining yourself aren't there. Of course, it sort of begs an interesting question because in America, where you don't have very good safety nets and people who are rational, they should be saving like crazy and be quite pessimistic. They do the opposite.
Well, it affects even Scots. That's the.
What do you mean? Oh, the Scots? Well,
Yeah.
they've got to be more frugal, though, aren't they? No. Okay. Yeah.
You haven't mentioned the
the rhetoric of Marxism. Marx, after all, was no friend of savings.
Let's see, I got to think about that one.
It would seem to me that the Chinese case, the Russian case, and lots of other cases would have been affected by the belief, insofar as a true belief, in Marxism.
Now why is Marx not a fan of saving?
Well, because you don't have any property in a Marxist system, therefore you don't need to save anything.
Okay, but let's put it this way. Let's say you're in a communist system, and you want to extract wealth. Well, you can extract it in taxes, but people don't readily like to give up lots in taxes, even in communist systems. They find ways of hoarding. So savings is an alternative because it's somewhat attractive. The money goes, might be loaned at low interest to the state, but people feel they're getting something back. I mean, and, you know, so I'm not sure that I would make the statement you did that Marxists are necessarily unfriendly to saving. It has a lot of things that fit a socialist and communist mentality. It depresses consumption, conspicuous consumption. It generates an environment where people feel like, you know, they're all doing their bit and all that sort of thing. I mean, a lot of the social democracies after World War II very much like saving because it seemed fair to them. You know, it meant that the fat cats couldn't go around spending, that they should be saving. Their savings then could generate capital that would go into production that would employ workers. So it has a real socialist and social democratic element. Maybe it's just too theoretical to talk about Marxism. No, no. Well, right. I mean, you got to have wealth, right? And there wasn't a lot of wealth around.
Very, very briefly, we have in this country two sources of private expenditure, or two impositions on private expenditure. One is tertiary education, which is college education, university education, which is a form of saving or has been construed as such, and that's been covered on the public sector and elsewhere. And I wonder if this is a substitute. I mean, people put their savings into their homes, but they may also construe, or they may not have the option once they've paid for private education to save as much, and the same might hold in a certain sense. That would, I'll leave it at that.
Of course, well, that's a little double-edged though, because so if you have to provide more for education, it's privatized, as you say, then you should be saving up. I mean, it was often given as an explanation why the Japanese were such great savers in the 1970s, because they actually had to pay significant higher education costs. Same thing was used for the Koreans. So that education actually should call for long-term saving.
Financial aid systems? Do they have financial aid systems in Japan and Korea?
Not as much, but I don't know that.
The gaming of the financial aid
yeah. Well, there is some of that. I'm not sure that would show up in an. I mean, again, if you had total rationality, people should be saving up when their children are very young. I mean, we're told that, but people apparently aren't doing it. And people may have a Pollyannish view of how much financial education's out there. That's not actually true. But they're believing what they want to believe, and they're not saving up. But, I mean, so it can work both ways.
Could we call for a couple of last questions? Yeah.
Hi, Marty Sherwin. I'm a senior scholar here. What happens to, is there a difference of what happens to the savings when it's passed on to generations in the countries that save and in Britain and America? Could that have anything to do with anything?
Yeah. That's a good question. I mean, I guess we're back to family. Yeah, sure, it has something to do with it. How I would put that in cross-national terms, I'm not sure I have any idea of. Again, which way do you think it would go? I mean, because I'm trying to puzzle this out, but in our system where you're not heavily taxed on inheritance, we should be saving up like crazy to pass it on, right? And in countries that have high tax rates on on inherited wealth, there should be much less incentive to save. And yet we're seeing the opposite. That's puzzling.
That's why I asked the question. I mean, it seems to me that the more I listened and tried to scheme out your analysis, the more the political dimension of this, sort of came to my mind. That I'm trying to see, what are the different boxes? There's homeowners, there's credit cards, there's national policy, but why is national policy different in country A than it's different in country B? If we all live in a capitalist system, savings should be good for the economy or it should be bad for the economy. But there seem to be two capitalist systems or two theories of what's good for the economy. On the other hand, is it large economy versus, moderate-sized economy?
I mean, remember, Germany and Japan are not small countries, okay? And so that one's not going to work. I mean, America's enormous, but these are not small countries. So I see what you're all trying to get at. You want that one variable. I mean, I would say in recent years, probably it's going to make us look at other variables, but the ample provision of credit, I think, is probably the single most important thing in this country that has really eroded saving in the last 20, 25 years. So you could start from that question and say, what is it in the public policy, the cultural norms, et cetera, that allow our political system to provide credit in such generous portions without various safeguards and things like that, whereas in places like Germany and certainly Japan until fairly recently and a lot of other European countries, there is a real ambivalence, even antipathy toward an what they would call excessive credit or excessive consumption, a sense that things get out of balance. And so that gets us back to this question: how do you get these very different political cultures? And that's where I think history does help. That's where I think your notion of two capitalist orders is very useful. Clearly, in most of these other countries, there is a much stronger notion of society as distinct from economic efficiency or the marketplace, and that a notion that society has to be protected. I mean, the Germans go crazy when it comes to Citibank or somebody who wants to come in and introduce credit cards. I mean, that there's enormous amount of resistance to that. There's enormous amount of resistance in law, but in politics, and you see this in a lot of other places. Your Australian story, okay, Australia's sort of in between, but there's a certain point at which people get uncomfortable. We don't want to have things that unfettered. So, we're sort of back to maybe American exceptionalism, that yes, all these other things are happening elsewhere, but it's amazing how the restraints have been so totally removed in the United States and much less in other countries. And I do think history and politics are part of the making of these cultures. And we have to look at them. We have to look at the policies. We have to look at the discourse. And I think that gets us fairly far toward explaining these things.
Charles, that's a very eloquent way of bringing this discussion to a close, and we want to continue it over a glass of wine. Thank you, Charles, for the